Well, it's great to see you again today. I hope that your day is going well so far. Let's go ahead and get organized for our lesson. For materials today, you are going to want to have on hand activities 3-1, 3-2, and 3-3. 3-1 is going to be part of your assignment. 3-2 you can fill in during the lesson. And activity 3-3, we'll try to get to some of that during the lesson as well. Okay, so we're not going to complete all of those during the lesson, but we'll work on 3-2 and 3-3 a little bit during that time, so have those handy. On our agenda today, we're going to start with a review of water in motion. Then we're going to move on to our climate chart. Climate is our main topic of the day, and then we will look at a geographer's corner toward the end of the lesson. Our main idea today, there are 5 broad categories of climate that describe the world today. Goals: distinguish the 12 major divisions of climates, distinguish the temperature and precipitation of the 4 moderate climates, and identify the effect of the lapse rate on the highland climates. Let's go ahead and begin with our chapter verse. Read along with me, Genesis 8:22. While the earth remaineth, seedtime and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. All right, we're going to review some terms. So I will give you the definition from our previous lesson, and you see if you can come up with the term. The change of water from a solid to a vapor, or vice versa. Sublimation, that one's a little less common. The giving off of water vapor by plants. Transpiration. The change of water from a liquid to a vapor. Evaporation. The change of water from a vapor to a liquid. Condensation. The point at which water condenses. Dew point. The fall of water to the ground. Precipitation. Precipitation over a mountain. Remember that one? Orographic precipitation. The amount of water vapor in the air is referred to as humidity. The water cycle is also known as the hydrologic cycle. Precipitation caused by hot air which rises and cools rapidly. That's our convection precipitation. What do we call slow-moving water under the Earth's surface? Groundwater. And finally, precipitation caused when 2 air masses meet. The line where they meet is a front, and so this is frontal precipitation. All right, now we're going to get right into our topic of climate today. We're going to start by defining climate. How does climate differ from weather? What do you think about that? You know what weather is, but how is climate different? Or is it different? Climate is actually the typical weather in a region over a long period of time. So weather is going to change more often. Climate is going to remain constant for the most part. I mean, there'll be variations from day to day, but the climate is going to remain constant. And as our main idea said, there are 5 broad categories of climate. However, there are 12 major divisions, and each major division fits under one of the 5 categories. And you might think, well, that sounds complicated, but it makes it easier because you can kind of lump the climates together. Instead of trying to remember 12, you can remember 5, and then you can remember a few details about those 5. You want to keep in mind that some books might make different divisions. So if you look in another book, they might have some different categories, or they might have a certain climate under a different category. All right? Now, the 5 basic categories, they kind of come in pairs. First, we have tropical rainy. What would be a pair to tropical rainy? Or just rainy? Think of dry. Think of opposites. Then we have cold, and an opposite, not exactly opposite. An opposite would be hot, but it's actually moderate. So you can think of those pairs. And then we have another. Just an other category, and it only has one climate in it. So it's pretty easy to remember. Just think rainy, dry, cold, moderate, and other. And that should be pretty simple. Now the tropical rainy, we'll start there just at the top and work our way through. It has 2 divisions. Wet, so we have tropical rainy wet, and a lot of times we refer to the climates as having to do with the type of vegetation, and that's an easier way to remember it, rainforest. And we have tropical rainy, wet, and dry, and that's referred to sometimes as savanna. Now, where do you think these climates occur? Pretty easy, isn't it? In the tropics, because they're tropical, wet, and tropical, wet, and dry. So they're occurring in the tropics, so think of your equator up to the tropics, in the area actually, we could say between the tropics. And the tropics have heavy rainfall, about 10 inches a month, and of course they're very warm, right, because they're near the equator. And in your textbook on pages 48 and 49 is your climate map. You want to have this open because we're going to be referring to this a lot in this lesson and in the next lesson, and you won't be able to see all the detail you need from my map. I'll just be pointing to where you need to look. And you can see the color for our tropical rainy. We have like a salmon and a peach color, the 2 top colors. You can see them all along the equator here. Here are tropics, and notice how much salmon and pink is right between them. So that's easy to remember. They're the tropical wet and tropical wet and dry. Now the rainforests remain wet year-round, and they're able to support large trees, and there are hundreds of varieties of plants in rainforests. However, the savanna, it's the tropical wet and dry. It has a dry season, and therefore it can only support grasses and some of the smaller trees that you see there, because during that dry season, trees can't get enough water to support the huge trees that we find in the tropical rainforests. Okay? All right, we'll move on to the pair with tropical rainy was dry, right? So our dry climate is divided into 2 types. We have dry, tropical, and temperate, or just tropical and temperate dry. That's desert area. And we have semi-arid. Arid just means dry. So we have semi-dry, which is also called steppe. So let's look in your textbook for those. The tropical and temperate dry desert is yellow, and the semi-arid is gold. And you can see they fall around 20 to 30 degrees, kind of in that bar right there. Actually, 20 to 40 degrees. So the ones that are near the tropics will be your tropical, and the ones that are in the temperate zone will be your temperate. And then below the equator, we see in that same area in South America, Africa, and Australia, we have a lot of the yellow and the gold. So they are following a pattern. Okay, they're following a pattern. Now the equator, remember, the warm water rises and cools, and the water falls right back down on the equator. Then remember circular motion? A lot of cool air is going to fall in these areas. It's cooling and falling, and so it's going to be dry there because the water has already fallen on the equator. So those are our dry regions. Now deserts are classified according to precipitation, the water that we're talking about, not actually heat. A lot of times people think, oh, the desert's so hot. Well, most deserts are hot, but technically we could even say Greenland is a desert because it receives less than 10 inches of precipitation a year. And that's our typical definition for desert. less than 10 inches of precipitation a year. The steppe also receives little rain, but it does receive enough to support grasses and grains, and so it's also known as the prairie. That's what we call it in the United States, the prairie lands. All right, let's move on to our moderate climates. There are 4 categories of moderate climates, and one of your goals today was to be able to distinguish them. So you need to be able to keep them separate. Moderate climates. We have marine west coast, Mediterranean, and that doesn't have to be capitalized. You can, but it doesn't have to be. Humid continental and humid subtropical. Okay? Now, most of the world's civilizations are actually in these areas, the moderate climates, because that's where the best farmlands are. Now, which latitude zone do these climates occur in? Thinking about it, we only have 3, right? The tropics, which we already talked about, the polar regions, which obviously are not going to be that, so they're going to fall in the middle latitudes or the temperate zones. And temperate and moderate can be synonyms, so that's one way to help you remember that. Now, if we look back to our map here on this page, notice the coloring. Our moderate areas are all some type of green. You want to look carefully at that. Your marine west coast is kind of like an aqua. Mediterranean is like an olive green. Humid continental is a dark green. And humid subtropical is a bright, almost a neon green. Notice where you see most of these greens in the temperate zones. Right through here, a little bit there, and also here. Not as much in the southern hemisphere, not as much land there in that area. Okay, notice also Africa has very, very little green, and think this is the world's best farmland, so that's one reason we hear so much about problems feeding everyone in Africa. They don't have a lot of the really good farmland. All right, now let's look at them individually a little bit. Our marine west coast has a lot of rain, about 3 inches during the summer and twice as much, 6 inches during the winter. So you see a lot of lush vegetation there, and that's named for the west coast of Europe, which has this type of climate. And then when they find that climate in other places, they name it the same thing, marine west coast. You'll notice, though, there are a few spots of it that are actually on the west coast of a country. So that's why it's named that way. It's not necessarily that it has to be on the west coast. All right. Then we have our Mediterranean, and they have dry summers and wet winters. So they really have little vegetation without irrigating it, and it's of course named for the Mediterranean Sea. Those countries around the Mediterranean Sea have this type of climate. Then we have our humid continental, and they do have rain, but it's irregular because it has to travel a long ways from the ocean to the interior of the continent. And this again is named for continental Europe, and then when we find the same type of climate in other places, it's called humid continental. Then we have humid subtropical, and this is considered the very best farmland in the world, and you can notice it's that bright green, so it kind of matches the neon green from your textbook, and they have plenty of rain to support good crops and a lot of green vegetation, plants and grasses. Okay, now I'm going to move on to our cold divisions. There are 3 cold divisions. Ice cap, that'll be easy to remember. Polar, also known as tundra, and subpolar, taiga. Now, these cold divisions are generally too cold to support much vegetation. The average temperature is less than 0 degrees Fahrenheit, but there is some vegetation. And of course, these are going to be at the polar regions. That's pretty easy to think of. And when you look in your textbook, you'll notice that these are done in white and blues. So these all have a nice color theme, and you can see them right here along near the poles in Asia, North America. Greenland is totally white, and then of course Antarctica almost totally white with a little bit of the dark blue. The ice cap, of course, is just a thick layer of ice. It never melts, and then and of course there's no vegetation on it either. Polar is cold year-round. There's a little bit of vegetation in the summer. You can see a few clumps of vegetation there. Some can be supported during the summer months. And then subpolar is gets up warm enough to support evergreen trees. They're pretty hardy trees, and so it does have more vegetation than the ice cap or the polar regions. Now, one last category and division is our other division, or our other category, and it includes varied highland. You want to remember that as altitude increases, temperature does what? It decreases, doesn't it? Temperature drops, and that's where we get our varied highland climates. The change is known as the lapse rate, and for every 1,000 feet of increase in altitude, temperature decreases approximately 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. That is known as the lapse rate. And when you climb a mountain, it has the same effect on the weather as traveling toward the poles. So therefore, climates along the mountains vary according to the altitude, because at the bottom it might be nice and warm, and then the higher up you go, the cooler it's going to get, so they're going to have a different type of climate. So instead of having all these little rainbow colors on all the mountains of the world, we have simply the brown color to show varied highland. And you can see this in your textbook. Varied highland, we have the Rocky Mountains, we have the Andes Mountains, and so on. We have the Himalayas and different areas where mountains are shown, and they get high enough that the vegetation changes with the altitude in those areas. And here you can see a good example of that. Some grass at the bottom, then we have some trees as we go up, and we see a lot of snow and a lot less vegetation there as we rise, and the altitude increases and the temperature decreases on this mountain. Now, as we're going to be referring to climate a lot throughout the year, a great deal, every country we go to will be interested in the climate of the region and that country, because it will affect the culture of the people, what they do for a living, and so on. So that's why we want to really be familiar with it. So you're going to use the map in your textbook to answer some questions. There's a little box there entitled Let's Go Exploring. So let's explore this map together. For each type of climate, give the continent where it appears most. You have to do some judgment calls here, but give the continent where it appears most. Okay, first of all, we have our peach, tropical wet. Look at the peach. Here's peach, peach, peach. That one's a pretty easy one, isn't it? It's going to be South America. Okay, then we have our savanna. That's the pink color. Again, it's in pretty much the same areas. Pink, 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 pink. A little bit of pink there. Kind of close with Africa, but again, it's going to be South America. We have the two regions of savanna there in South America. What about our desert areas, the yellow desert? Overwhelmingly Africa, isn't it? A lot of desert area there in Africa, and also some near the southern tip as well. Okay, then what about our steppe? That's the golden color. Where do you see the most gold? There's some in the U.S., tiny bit in South America, a little bit in Africa, some in Asia, a little bit in Australia. It looks like Asia is going to have the most of our steppe throughout that area. What about our marine west coast? That's the aqua color. That one's pretty easy. A tiny bit in the U.S. on the west, some in South America, some in the eastern section of Africa and Australia and all of New Zealand. But look at Europe. Overwhelmingly, Europe and some of Scandinavia have that marine west coast climate. Okay, what about our Mediterranean? That's the olive color. That's going to be pretty obvious, isn't it? Europe, because there's the Mediterranean Sea. You can see most of it is in Europe, a tiny bit in Africa as well. Okay, humid continental. That's our dark green, U.S., Asia. Look like they have the most. So, what do you want to say here? Humid continental. Maybe you might say Eurasia. would probably have the most if you want to combine those. Asia has a little bit over here as well. We have the humid subtropical. That's our neon green. Here's some areas of that. What has the most? Looks like it's pretty close, but it looks like it's probably going to be Asia with this big portion right here, and some on the islands as well. Then our ice cap, that's a pretty easy one. That's going to be Antarctica, right? We have polar, that's the dark blue. And that looks like it's going to be North America, doesn't it? Here's the dark blue, North America. Islands of Canada has the most. And then subpolar is our light blue. And that one's going to go to Asia, isn't it? Varied highland. Well, we have a few scattered mountains, but it's going to go to Asia as well, right there near the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau. Okay, now that just kind of gives us a good idea of where these are going to fall, so that's why we're answering some of these questions to give us practice with the map and the patterns, where the different climates fall the most. Okay, here's another question. What is the most common climate at the equator? This is one we answered before. Here's our equator. Just follow it along, and what do you see the most of? That salmon, that dark pink. So it's going to be rainforest at the equator. Not desert, as some people think, because it is hot at the equator, but there's plenty of moisture. Where is a humid subtropical climate most common? On the east coast or on the west coast of continents? So first of all, humid subtropical, that is your bright green. Here it is on the east coast of the U.S., the east coast of South America, and the east coast of Asia. Tiny bit on the east coast of Africa and on the east coast of Australia, so it's really, really easy, the east coast. Why do deserts almost never occur on the equator? I need to pause the program and think about that one. All right, remember our constant hot air rises and falls. It's the convection type of precipitation. The land cools during the evening so that you have a cool mass of air. Then it warms up really fast in the day. You have a hot mass of air and it breaks through and you have that convection precipitation. So you don't have any deserts on the equator. They're more common around 30 degrees latitude, where that cool air is coming back down, the cool air that doesn't have the moisture in it because the moisture's already fallen over the equator. Now there are two simple factors that help us remember the climate and define the type of climate. Those are simply temperature and precipitation. You can see a chart on your activity 3.2, I believe it is. This is a replica of the chart that you have. Temperature right here and precipitation. So we'll be answering let's just go ahead and answer a couple questions to get you started, but this will help you see the patterns, more of the patterns in the climate areas. So our first question is, which climate has the highest summer temperature? We just look right here to temperature, summer, scan down. We can clearly see 81 is the highest. So our tropical and temperate dry is the highest. Which climate has the highest winter temperature? We're looking in the temperature column again, but for winter, we see that it's 79. Both of our tropical rainy climates. And let's do one more together. Which climate has the lowest temperature? And right here we have -14 in the cold ice cap of the polar regions. So you'll be answering those questions just to get you more familiar with the different climates we'll be using all year long. Now I want to go ahead and take a look at our Geographer's Corner on climographs, which combine temperature and precipitation.
I just know you'll want to be part of my exciting explorations. Really, when you consider the value, the discovery, the excitement involved in these explorations, while the money is only a small part of it. Think of it as an investment. And I've got another tool to help me along the way. Wolfgang, I need the chart. This is a climograph. It combines two important pieces of information about the city. the Durchschnittstemperatur, sorry, I forgot you don't know German, the average temperature and the average precipitation. These letters here, J, F, M, A, and so on, these are the months of the year. This helps me visualize what the city is like as far as temperature and rainfall go. This marks the temperature here on the left, and here on the right this shows the rainfall. But climate graphs show only averages. So in this city, on a given day, the temperature could exceed 100 degrees, even though that's not in the average. And the monthly rainfall could be as low as half an inch. But you wouldn't know that from the chart, since again it's only an average. Now, let's determine the average rainfall in Miami in October. Let me see here. Here is the rainfall, and here are the months, October, and we find that October has about 8 inches of rain. Now, what about the coldest month of the year in New York, on average? Go down here to the temperature and the months, and we see that the lowest temperature falls in February. This is a fine way for me to more accurately plan for my expeditions. And I'm sure you will want to have a hand in this too, with your financial investment, of course.
All right, now that we have the idea of climate graphs, let's take a closer look at them by using your activity 3.3. And our first section tells us to look at page 230. They're actually climate graphs spread throughout your textbook, so you'll be flipping around a lot. But our first question is, what is the average temperature in the hottest month? Here's our temperature, so here's the highest point. Looks like it's about 62 degrees. Average temperature in the coldest month is going to be about a -2 degrees. Does Moose Factory get more precipitation in the summer or the winter? Here we see the most precipitation, August, September, so that's going to be in the summer months. And that's what you're going to be doing, going through, answering the questions about those different climate graphs in different cities, and some of them, I believe, ask you to do some comparisons, perhaps, between two cities and try to determine what type of climate they actually have, what category of climate they'll fit into. All right, so I'll be letting you finish the rest of that up as part of your assignment. I'm sure you're really thrilled to hear that. But that does wrap up our lesson today. So let's go ahead and take a look at your assignment. You want to go ahead and read our section, pages 48 through 51. The section review is on page 51. You'll need to complete that. Complete activities 3.1, 3.2, and 3.3. Now you should have about half of activity 3.1 completed already. That's the map activity. You just want to go up and go ahead and finish up any of the numbers that you haven't labeled yet on that map, or any of the questions you haven't answered. 3.2 is the one that we just barely got started on, concerning the climates of the world, that chart. And then of course you'll have 3.3, and you'll need to flip through your textbook to find those different climate graphs and answer the questions from activity 3.3. Now as you read, think about this question. Based on the weather patterns in your area, in which of the 12 climate types do you live? Then check the climate map to see if it supports your conclusion. Now let's see if you found the answer to our Where in the World question from last time. Where is the world's smallest official park? It's in Portland, Oregon, on a traffic island on Southwest Front Avenue. And before next time, see if you can find out what country's main language is Magyar.